The morning of the 12th of January, 1888, the temperature across Dakota Territory was sitting in the low 40s, not below zero, but above zero, warm enough that children left for school without their coats. Farmers stepped outside without hats and decided the worst was behind them. After weeks of brutal cold, the air felt almost like spring. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, the temperature had dropped 50 degrees. People froze to death 12 feet from their own front doors. Ole Olesen Thailand, 70 years old, made it to within 12 feet of his threshold and went no further. Cecilia Knutsen collapsed under a sled 40 steps from her house. The snow wasn't falling, it was moving sideways, fine as flour, driven at 50 miles an hour, freezing eyes shut mid-step. Fargo would bottom out at negative 47 degrees that night. A station in Montana reported negative 56. 235 people died across the northern plains in a single afternoon. That storm is now called the Schoolhouse Blizzard of 1888, and it is one of the deadliest weather events in American frontier history. That same winter, in Cass County in the eastern part of Dakota Territory, one structure that everyone in the settlement had been laughing at for 3 months did not fail. It did not crack. It did not run out of heat. Inside it, a 31-year-old widow named Marta Vik sat near her cast-iron stove, read by lamplight, and listened to the wind tear at everything her neighbors had built. Marta Vik had arrived in Dakota Territory in the spring of 1885, not by choice but by the logic of a widow's options. Her husband, Emil, had died of typhoid fever in a Minnesota boarding house in October of 1884, leaving her with $43, a trunk of clothes, and a name on a land parcel he had registered the previous year under the Homestead Act, 160 acres of unbroken Dakota prairie, the filing fee paid, the 5-year residency clock already running. She had 2 choices: walk away from it and go back to her sister's house in Stillwater, or go claim it. She went to claim it. She was not the only woman doing this. Under the Homestead Act of 1862, any person 21 or older who was the head of a family could file, and single women, widows, and divorced women all qualified legally as heads of household. Women filed roughly 1 in every 4 claims across the Great Plains during the Homestead era, and the data shows they proved up their land at rates slightly higher than men. That does not mean it was easy. It means they found ways to make it work that men with more money and more neighbors weren't always willing to try. Marta arrived at her parcel in late April 1885. Emil had registered the land but done nothing with it. No claim shanty, no well, no broken sod, just grass and wind and a surveyor's stake. The settlement nearest to her claim was 3 miles east, a collection of 22 families who had come over 2 previous springs and already had cabins built, root cellars dug, and gardens started. She built a claim shanty that first summer, 12 feet by 14 feet, rough-cut lumber from a mill 30 miles south. Walls lined with old newspapers and tar paper. It was standard construction, the kind everyone built when they first arrived. She proved her residency in it through the summer and fall of 1885 and through the winter of 1885-86, which was cold but manageable, nothing worse than she had seen in Minnesota. It was the fall of 1886 that changed everything. Her neighbor Jens Abrahamsen lost his milk cow in September to some kind of gut sickness and spent most of what he had left trying to replace it. The family to her north, the Rains, had a bad wheat yield. Hail in July had taken 1/3 of their crop. By October, Marta herself had $6.40 to her name and a woodpile that would last her, at best, 6 weeks, and a Dakota winter that required 6 weeks of wood was not a Dakota winter. She had heard from the Abrahamson boy that there was an old railroad car sitting on an abandoned siding about 4 miles northwest, up near where the Northern Pacific had halted a branch line extension 3 years earlier. The branch had never been finished, money trouble, something to do with the railroad's finances, and when the crews pulled out, they left behind 2 boxcars, a handcar, and a pile of rotting cross ties. One of the boxcars had been stripped, door gone, hardware gone, most of the floorboards pulled up and taken. The other one sat intact except for a hole in the roof the size of a dinner plate where the iron sheeting had rusted through and the boards below it had gone soft. She walked 4 miles to look at it. The car was a standard-gauge wooden boxcar, built somewhere in the early 1870s, maybe 14 or 15 years old by then, about 35 feet long, 8 feet wide, 7.5 feet of interior height. The outside was weathered grey, the paint gone, the lower boards dark with moisture. The iron truss rods underneath were streaked orange with rust. 3 of the floorboards near the damaged roof section had rotted through, and you could see the frozen ground below. She walked the length of it twice, pressing the boards with her thumb, knocking on the walls with her knuckle. Most of it was solid. The frame was sound. The walls, 2 inches thick of tongue and groove pine, were dry where the roof hadn't leaked. She went to find whoever owned the railroad right-of-way. It took her 2 weeks and a trip to the county seat. But the short answer was that the Northern Pacific had no active claim on abandoned equipment left on an unfinished siding, and no agent willing to make the drive out to retrieve it. The county land officer told her that if she could get it off the siding and onto her own land, it was hers, and he wrote her a document saying as much. Later, telling the story to her neighbour's wife, she said she'd paid $1 for it, the notary fee for the document. That number stuck. $1 for a rotting train car. She could not move a 35-foot boxcar by herself. She hired the Abrahamson boy, 17 years old, strong for a week of labour paid in the only currency she had, a promise of half a cord of firewood in the spring and 2 meals a day while he worked. She borrowed a team of 4 horses from Jens Abrahamson, who was sceptical but not unkind, and 2 heavy timber beams from the Rahn farm. Getting the car off the siding rails was the first problem. The wheels were frozen to the track with rust and 3 years of weather. They freed them with a combination of fire built beneath the axles, iron bars used as levers, and patience. The car rolled off the rail ends and onto the timbers slowly, tilting sideways, one end dropping into the frozen dirt before they got the second team of horses under it. They dragged it 4 miles across open prairie in 2 days, and it left a scar in the grass you could see for years afterward. She had chosen her site carefully, the east side of a low rise in her land, a natural berm of earth that ran maybe 30 feet long and 4 feet high before dropping back to grade. The rise sat on the northwest side of where she intended to place the car. She oriented the car so that its narrow end, the end wall only 8 feet wide, pointed due northwest, and the long side of the car, 35 feet of it, ran southeast. Her neighbour Christopher Ness watched all of this from across the fence and said nothing for 2 weeks. Then one morning he rode over and told her she was making a mistake. He said a wood frame cabin with proper chinking and a good stove was what worked out here, that everyone who'd tried something else had ended up cold or dead, and that she was going to freeze to death in a train car. She thanked him for his concern and went back to work. He was not wrong. Exactly, a wood frame cabin with good chinking and a full woodpile absolutely worked. The problem was she didn't have the materials for one or the money to buy them. What she had was the car. The first thing she did was repair the roof. She salvaged iron sheeting from the stripped car nearby, cutting it to size with a cold chisel and bending it to match the arc of the roof. She sealed the edges with a mixture of pine pitch and river clay, tamped in tight and allowed to freeze solid. The hole was gone by the end of the first day of real work. Then she started on the walls. And this is where the story gets interesting, because what Marta did next is not something she invented. She was doing what physics demanded, even if she didn't have the language for it. A wooden boxcar wall 2 inches of tongue and groove pine has an insulating value of roughly R2-4. That sounds like something until you understand what it means in practice. To maintain 70 degrees inside when it's -40 outside, a temperature difference of 110 degrees, A wall with R2, 4 will bleed approximately 45 BTUs of heat per square foot per hour. The average boxcar has about 900 square feet of wall, roof and floor surface, which means a structure that needs roughly 40,000 BTUs of heat every hour just to stay warm, more than a single wood stove can reliably produce, and it would consume a cord of firewood every 9 or 10 days. She couldn't afford that, and nobody on her claim could. But there was something available to her in enormous quantities, for free, within 2 miles in every direction. Prairie grass, dead and dry by October. Cattail fluff from the slough a mile north. Sawdust from the mill scraps she'd piled behind her old shanty. Dried leaves from the scrubby cottonwoods along the creek. She built a second wall inside the first one. She framed it herself, rough 1x3 boards nailed to the interior walls of the boxcar, creating a cavity between the old wall and the new one of about 5.5 inches. Then she packed that cavity tight with everything she had. Dried grass, sawdust, cattail fluff, more dried grass, tamping it down with a stick and filling it again. What she was doing, in the language that would be developed a century later, was creating dead air insulation. Air that moves carries heat away from a surface fast. That's the same principle that makes wind chill dangerous. But trapped, still air that cannot convect, behaves completely differently. The fibres of dried grass and cattail down are not themselves the insulation. The insulation is the millions of tiny pockets of still air trapped between those fibres. It's why birds have feathers and why wool works. And it's the same principle in modern fiberglass insulation, which is just glass spun into fibres thin enough to trap air between them. Marta Vik had no fiberglass, but she had a slough full of cattails and a prairie full of dead grass, and she was working with the same underlying physics. At 5.5 inches, packed grass runs about R1, 3 per inch, and sawdust layers add R1, 5 to R2 per inch. Mixed together and tightly packed, she was building something in the range of R8 to R10 for that cavity, combined with the 2 inches of pine on each side of it. Her total wall assembly was reaching R11 to R13. That changes the arithmetic completely. At R13, the same wall that was bleeding 45 BTUs per square foot per hour is now bleeding about 8.5. Total heat loss for the structure drops from 40,000 BTUs per hour to roughly 11,000, and a medium cast iron stove, burning at even 30% efficiency, delivers around 12,000 usable BTUs per hour. She could keep pace. Christopher Ness rode by again in the 3rd week of October and watched her stuff dried grass into the wall cavity she'd built. He called it a rat's nest, said it would smell by spring, said the moisture in the grass would rot the boards before February. He was not entirely wrong about the moisture problem. Wet insulation loses its R value as water displaces the air pockets, but she had thought about this. She gathered the driest material she could find, stored it in the boxcar for 2 weeks before packing it to drive off any surface moisture, and she left the wall cavity open at the top for the first 2 weeks of work, so that the drying continued as she filled. She also hung the inner wall boards with a slight gap at the bottom, just enough for any condensation to drain rather than pool. The floor was next. The original boxcar floor, where it hadn't rotted, was 2-inch pine plank on heavy timber sills. The ground underneath was frozen, and frozen ground in Dakota Territory can pull enormous amounts of heat downward through an uninsulated floor. She dug out below the rotted sections 3 boards near the bad roof area and replaced them with new planks cut from the stripped car next door. Then she laid a second floor layer on top of the existing one, flat stones gathered from the creek bed, each one roughly the size of a dinner plate, laid in 2 rows that ran the length of the car and mortared in place with river clay. The stones added thermal mass. During the day, when the stove ran, the stones absorbed heat slowly, and after she banked the fire for the night, they continued to release that stored heat for 4 to 6 hours. Cast iron has a specific heat of about 460 joules per kilogram per degree, but stone runs closer to 750 to 900, meaning it stores more heat per pound. 37 flat creek stones, averaging maybe 25 pounds each, put nearly half a ton of thermal mass on her floor, radiating warmth through the night. She positioned the stove, a cast-iron potbelly she'd salvaged from her claim shanty, in the centre of the car, not against one wall. Heat from a stove radiates in all directions, and pressed against a wall, half that radiation goes straight into the wall. Centred in the space, the radiant heat reached the stone floor on all sides, the walls on all sides, and the bedding she laid along one wall. She cut her stovepipe hole through the roof on the leeward side southeast, so that prevailing northwest wind wouldn't drive rain or snow directly down the pipe. She extended the pipe 18 inches above the roof peak and capped it with a piece of bent iron sheeting that functioned as a crude wind deflector, keeping downdraft from killing the draw. By early November 1886, she moved out of her claim shanty and into the boxcar. Christopher Ness's wife, Ingeborg, came by to see it. She stood in the doorway for a moment and then stepped inside. The interior was about 30 feet of usable length by 7.5 feet wide, roughly 220 square feet of living space, larger than many claim shanties. The walls were finished with the inner board layer, smooth-planed. A kerosene lamp hung from a ceiling hook. The stone floor was swept clean. The stove radiated visible heat shimmer. Ingeborg said it was warm, said it was warmer than her kitchen, and this got back to Christopher. He rode over again, stood in the doorway, and said nothing for a moment. Then he said that the real test would be January, and that January would tell whether she'd been clever or just lucky. He was right that January would be the test, he just didn't know how right he was. The winter of 1886-87 was already destroying ranching operations across the territory before it reached its worst point. An ice storm on November 16 had glazed the grass in an inch of clear ice, sealing away the forage that free-range cattle depended on. Blizzards hit again in late November and twice in December. By the end of December, drifts stood 15 feet high in the coulees and draws. The Northern Pacific was running trains hours late, then days late, as cuts filled with snow faster than crews could clear them. In Montana, the cattlemen were already calculating losses. Theodore Roosevelt, ranching near Medora in Dakota Territory, had put his herds out on open range that fall, with the kind of optimism that the cattle boom of the early 1880s had created. He would later write to Henry Cabot Lodge that there had been a perfect smash-up all through the cattle country of the Northwest, and by spring 1887, Roosevelt had lost most of his herd and left the cattle business for good. Granville Stewart's DHS ranch in Montana lost 60% of roughly 40,000 head. Nelson Story of Bozeman lost 2/3 of his stock. Montana Territory alone recorded the death of an estimated 362,000 cattle that winter, more than half the territorial herd, and losses exceeded $20 million. In Cass County, the January cold was severe, but not catastrophic on its own. The Abrahamson stove ran out of good wood by the first week of January, and Jens started burning green cottonwood, which produces little heat and a lot of creosote. His pipe developed a partial blockage by January 10 that let carbon monoxide seep into the cabin, bad enough that he had to open the door in negative 30-degree weather to clear the air. He lost 2 fingers to frostbite from that episode. Christopher Ness's wood supply lasted, but his cabin chinking had dried and cracked during the extreme cold, opening gaps that the wind found. He hung blankets over the north wall and slept in his coat. Marta's boxcar ran at a different pace entirely. The key was the orientation. The narrow end of the car, 8 feet wide, faced northwest into the prevailing wind. A 35-foot boxcar presenting its 8-foot face to a 60-mile-an-hour wind generates roughly 880 pounds of lateral force, and that same car turned broadside would catch more than 4,000 pounds of force. The narrow end to the wind meant the structure received less than a quarter of the buffeting it would have taken broadside, but more practically, it meant less infiltration. Wind pressure drives air through any gap it can find, and with the narrow end presenting and the long walls running more or less parallel to the prevailing wind, the pressure differential across those long walls was far lower. The wind wasn't pushing as hard against the seams. A frontier cabin with its flat rectangular face into the northwest wind catches the full pressure across its entire windward wall. Gaps widen, chinking cracks, and heat bleeds out faster than the stove can replace it. The boxcar's walls, tongue and groove planking engineered to keep freight dry through weather, with the added inner layer she'd built, stayed tight. She'd caulked every seam she could reach with the same pine pitch and clay mixture she'd used on the roof, and when she held a candle near the walls on the coldest nights, the flame barely wavered. On the morning of the 12th of January 1888, the thermometer she'd hung outside the east-facing wall read 41 degrees above zero. She had not lit the stove. The residual heat from the night before, stored in the stone floor and the thermal mass of the walls, had kept the interior above 50 degrees through the night on its own. She was outside splitting kindling when she heard it a sound she could not immediately identify, a low wall of pressure that hit her ears before the cold did. She looked northwest. The sky was changing, not slowly, but in the way a door opens, a line of dark moving fast. She had the door shut and bolted before the temperature dropped 20 degrees. What happened next across Dakota Territory and Nebraska and into Minnesota is documented in survivor accounts that were collected in the weeks and months afterward. Teachers in one-room schoolhouses burned their furniture to keep children alive. Minnie Mae Freeman, 19 years old, teaching 6 miles south of Ord, Nebraska, tied her 13 students together with a length of twine when the roof tore off her building and walked them a mile through the whiteout to safety. Lois May Royce in Plainview lost 3 students, 2 9-year-old boys and a 6-year-old girl, when they wandered off the path to her boarding house, only 82 yards away. The children froze to death before morning. Royce survived but lost both feet. Lena Wobecker, 11 years old, whose father had died of smallpox when she was 5, collapsed in the snow and spent the night lying on the frozen ground with a 6-year-old classmate on her knees. At daybreak she saw chimney smoke and dragged herself toward it. 1 foot was completely amputated, and she survived and learned to walk with a wooden prosthetic. The official death count from that single afternoon reached 235 people, and some historians believe the true number was closer to 500. Inside Marta's boxcar, the thermometer on the interior wall never dropped below 54 degrees. She kept the stove at low to medium output she had. Enough wood and the stone floor stayed warm to the touch throughout the worst night. The wind hit the narrow northwest end wall with full force and shook nothing. The car was held to the ground by its own iron underframe and the weight of 15 years of iron hardware, anchored against the natural berm of the rise on its northwest side. She had also, in November, piled 4 feet of earth against the long walls on both sides, not enough to fully berm the structure, but enough to cut the wind exposure on those surfaces and to add another layer of insulation at the base where cold air pooled lowest. The earth she'd piled ran to a depth of about 3 feet measured from the original grade. 3 feet down in Dakota Territory in January, the ground sits at roughly 42 degrees, far warmer than the negative 40-something air outside. The earth against the lower walls was not cold insulation. It was warm insulation, a sleeve of material that started at 40 degrees and shaded upward toward the air temperature only very gradually. The cold never reached the lower wall boards. By the second day she had visitors. Christopher Ness knocked on the east end door at 7 in the morning of January 13. He'd wrapped himself in 2 coats and his wife's wool shawl, and he was shaking when she opened the door. Behind him, 50 feet back, was Ingeborg, moving slowly. He said he couldn't keep the cabin above 28 degrees. His last good wood was gone, and he'd been burning fence posts. She let them in. The Abrahamsons came 3 hours later, Jens and his wife and the boy, his hands bandaged from the frostbite injury 3 days before. She had room. The car was 30 feet of livable space, 7.5 feet wide, stone floor, 1 stove, 6 people. By afternoon, the stove was burning at a fraction of its capacity and the interior sat at 68 degrees. The thermal mass of 6 bodies adds roughly 1,600 BTUs per hour to a space, which is not trivial, and human beings run warm enough to matter in a sealed room. They stayed 2 days and 2 nights. On the morning of January 15, the wind dropped. Temperatures remained cold, -25 in the afternoon, but the driving snow had stopped. The Abrahamsons left first, Jens moving carefully on his damaged hands. Christopher Ness stood at the door for a moment before leaving and said something to the effect that he owed her a cord of firewood by spring. He brought 2. The physics of what Marta did is not complicated to explain, it just runs contrary to what most people assume about metal and wood and heat. The assumption is that metal holds heat better, because metal feels different when you touch a hot pan. But what you're feeling when you touch hot metal is not the metal's insulating ability, it's the opposite. Metal conducts heat so rapidly that it dumps whatever temperature it has straight into your skin instantly, and that same conductivity works in both directions. Metal bleeds heat to the cold just as fast as it accepts it from a stove. A bare iron boxcar at -40 degrees would have been impossible to heat. Cast iron conducts heat 415 times faster than pine wood, and the single quarter-inch of iron plate on a steel car is, for thermal purposes, essentially invisible. Its R value is less than 4/1000 of one, compared to R2, 4 for 2 inches of pine. But Marta's car was not bare iron. It was a wooden car, 2 inches of tongue-and-groove pine, and she had added 5.5 inches of packed insulation inside that. The combined wall assembly sat somewhere around R11 to R13, and at those values, the heat loss across her 900 square feet of envelope dropped to roughly 11,000 BTUs per hour, something a single modest stove could cover, even at low efficiency. This is exactly the principle that passive house construction relies on today. Not exotic materials, not electric systems, not imported technology, but thick enough insulation that the structure holds its own heat. Modern passive house certification typically requires walls in the R40 to R60 range for extreme climates, and Marta's R13 was not at that level. But in a small space with a stove and a stone thermal mass, it was enough. She had also, without framing it this way, eliminated most of the thermal bridging in her structure. Thermal bridges are the gaps and fasteners and structural members that create paths of low resistance for heat to travel through a wall. A standard wood-framed cabin has dozens of them. Every stud is a thermal bridge, but her inner wall ran continuous across the original pine wall behind it, with the insulation layer filling the cavity completely, leaving almost no uninsulated path from warm interior to cold exterior. The stone floor was the final piece. At the end of a long cold day, the residual heat stored in 37 flat creek stones is not glamorous, but it is real. Stone at 1,000 joules per kilogram per degree Kelvin, roughly 950 kilograms of stone, heated to 68 degrees through the day. That's enough stored energy to release a meaningful amount of warmth through a long night with the fire banked low. She could bank the fire at 10 o'clock and wake to a 50-degree interior at 6 in the morning without adding wood. Her neighbours were not wrong that her solution looked strange. A boxcar is not a house, and stuffing dried grass into wall cavities is not how any carpenter would tell you to build. But her neighbours were reasoning from appearance, and she was, whether she knew it or not, reasoning from energy. She proved up her homestead claim in the spring of 1890, 5 years after arriving. The Homestead Act required continuous residency, a dwelling, and worked land, and her dwelling, the converted boxcar, satisfied the requirement. She filed on the 14th of April, 1890. The boxcar stood on her land until at least 1903, when county records show a frame addition built onto the east end, and by 1910, the car's body had been incorporated into the foundation of a larger house, the iron underframe serving as the floor sill of the expanded structure. This was not uncommon. Settlers used what they had, and what lasted they kept. The winter of 1886-87 ended the open-range cattle era across the northern plains. The losses were too large, the math too clear, and the era of the fenced range, the managed herd, the hay crop laid up for winter, began in 1887. Theodore Roosevelt, who had romanticized the open range in his books, went home to New York and eventually to politics. Charlie Russell, the young Montana cowboy, painted a postcard-sized watercolor of a dying steer surrounded by wolves and called it "Waiting for a Chinook." It is now one of the most recognized images of the American West, and he sent it to his employer as an answer to the question of how the cattle were doing. The Schoolhouse Blizzard of 1888 is less well remembered, but killed more people in a single day. It remained the benchmark storm in the memory of everyone who survived it. Ruth Chrisman, one of the famous homesteading sisters of Custer County, Nebraska, recalled decades later being caught at school when the storm hit and sheltering with a widowed neighbor who ran out of fuel and burned her chairs to keep the children warm. The widowed neighbor in that story had a name. History didn't preserve it. What history preserves is the fact that she had chairs to burn and that she burned them. Marta Vik in Cass County did not burn her chairs. She had thought about the cold before it arrived and done something about it, with materials that cost her almost nothing and physics that had been true since long before anyone built a railroad through Dakota Territory. What she understood without the terminology, without the engineering education, without anything except observation and necessity, is a principle that took the modern building industry most of the 20th century to properly codify. The thermal envelope of a structure matters more than the heating system inside it. Make the shell tight and insulated well enough, and the heat you generate stays where you put it. Make it loose and thin, and no stove on earth keeps up. Passive house design, developed in Germany in the early 1990s and now used worldwide, is built on exactly this logic. Thick insulation, airtight construction, thermal mass to smooth out temperature swings, and no complex systems or imported energy technologies required. The woman who lived in a train car in Dakota Territory in the winter of 1888 did not know she was designing a passive building. She knew she was cold, and she had a car, and she had a slough full of cattails. She worked with what the situation gave her, and she got the physics right. That's the part that tends to get lost when we tell stories about the frontier, the idea that the people who survived were not surviving on toughness or willpower alone. They were solving engineering problems with the materials at hand, and the ones who made it through understood something real about how heat moves and how structures fail, even if they never put it in those words. The temperature inside Marta Vik's boxcar on the night of the 12th of January 1888 was 54 degrees. Outside, it was somewhere between -40 and -47. The gap between those two numbers, nearly 100 degrees, was not luck. It was a wall packed with grass and sawdust and cattail fluff, a floor of creek stones, a stove centered in a sealed space, and a narrow end pointed into the wind. The math has always been that simple, and people have just kept forgetting it.